The Waldorf History's grand ballroom was a theater of opulence. Crystal chandeliers shimmered overhead like falling stars caught mid-descent. Dozens of tables glittered with silverware and fine china, each one hosting CEOs, senators, and socialites flown in from all corners of the globe. This wasn't just a wedding. It was the symbolic merging of two corporate kingdoms, Hayes Enterprises and Jennings Global, after decades of Cold War rivalries, hushed boardroom betrayals, and economic turf wars. At the head table sat Robert Hayes, the towering titan of logistics and global real estate. 64, refined, silver-haired, sharp-eyed. He was the kind of man who didn't wear power. He carried it in the way he entered a room. To those who knew him only from headlines and shareholder meetings, Robert was a ruthless strategist. But tonight, he was simply a father. His youngest son, Ryan, was finally marrying Grace Jennings, the poised and brilliant daughter of Harold Jennings, Robert's lifelong rival. Robert's fingers tightened slightly around his wine glass as he glanced across the room. Harold stood near the podium, smiling like a man who had won a war without firing a shot. His presence still made Robert's jaw tighten. The two men had once nearly torn the energy sector apart during a bidding war in the 90s. Tonight, they shook hands for the cameras, but history doesn't forget. Ryan looked radiant in his tailored white tuxedo, hand in hand with Grace, whose elegant gown caught the light like a ripple on water. They looked genuinely happy, and Robert wanted to be happy for them. He did. But beneath his calm exterior, a quiet ache gnawed at him, a 25-year-old wound that never fully healed. A fire, a ring of flames that devoured the guest house where Sarah, his wife, the love of his life, and their twin toddlers had been staying while he negotiated overseas. The reports had said electrical failure. The bodies had been unrecoverable, only ashes, only silence. Robert had buried 3 empty coffins. And yet, the part of him that built empires with blueprints and gut instincts never quite believed it. Then it happened. It was during the third toast, while waitstaff moved between tables, refilling glasses and delivering trays of chocolate soufflé, that Robert's eyes caught on something. A flash of green. A waitress, young, maybe mid-20s, dressed in the crisp black and white uniform of the catering team, was leaning to clear a plate near the stage. Her hair was pinned back, and she moved with quiet efficiency. Nothing unusual, except her hand. On her ring finger, gleaming under the overhead lights, was an emerald set in a delicate gold band shaped like overlapping vines. His design. Not one inspired by, not similar to, his. A custom ring he had commissioned for Sarah before their twins were born. He remembered selecting the stone himself, the deep forest green matching the color of Sarah's eyes on rainy days. He had sketched the setting on a napkin. Only one had ever been made. The glass in his hand slipped. It shattered against the floor, startling the surrounding guests. Conversations stilled. A waiter rushed over with a towel. But Robert didn't move. His eyes were locked on the girl. She looked up, startled by the noise. Their eyes met for a single second. Hers were wide, uncertain, a faint, familiar green, and for Robert Hayes, time stopped. The ballroom, the applause, the clinking glasses, all vanished in the hollow sound of memory flooding back. The ring on that girl's hand wasn't just jewelry. It was a message from a ghost, a whisper from a life he thought lost to flames. And suddenly, the wedding, the merging of two empires, the summit of decades of ambition meant nothing. Not if that ring meant what he feared it did. Not if she was who he suspected she might be. Zoe Harper hadn't meant to wear the ring to the wedding. It was an old habit, one she couldn't quite shake. Ever since she was a little girl, she'd kept the ring close. It was the only item she'd had when she was left at St. Mercy's orphanage. No note, no blanket, just the ring, tucked into the folds of her baby blanket like it was meant to protect her. The nuns had assumed it was costume jewelry, some sentimental token from a mother who couldn't stay. But Zoe always felt it was more. For years, she wore it on a chain around her neck. Only when she turned 18 did she risk having it resized to fit her finger. It had become her talisman, a reminder that she came from someone, even if she didn't know who. Something about it felt purposeful. The way the vines on the gold band twined into each other, the way the emerald caught the light and almost flickered like a flame. She never imagined it would become the key to everything. That moment came 2 months ago. She had been working a late paralegal shift at Rivera and Cole, sorting boxes for a case when Dr. Luke Wells, showed up. He was doing volunteer rounds at a nearby clinic and stopped in for coffee. They'd met a few times at community fundraisers, always struck by how strangely alike they looked. Both tall, lean, both with the same storm-dark hair and green eyes that always made people pause. She had even joked once, "Maybe we were twins separated at birth." Luke had laughed, then paused, then said, "You know, I never knew who my parents were either." What started as a joke quickly turned into a DNA test, half out of curiosity, half because they both needed answers. The result shattered them. 99.98% sibling match. Not just siblings, twins. Abandoned within a week of each other at different orphanages in neighboring counties. A paperwork mistake, the adoption agency had said. It should have ended there, a wild story to tell at parties. But then came the ring. Luke had been fiddling with it while they were talking, turning it over in his fingers. When he tapped it too hard on the edge of the desk, something shifted inside. The emerald popped slightly sideways, revealing a tiny compartment underneath the stone. Hidden there, impossibly preserved, was a sliver of something thin and metallic, no bigger than a fingernail. Microfilm. They took it to Maria Castellanos, a private investigator Zoe sometimes worked with through her firm. Maria had an old-school darkroom and enough curiosity to dig deeper. What she found blew the doors off everything Zoe thought she knew. Fraud, transfers, forged land deeds, bribes to a shell corporation tied to Jennings Global, all traced back to a single name, Harold Jennings, chairman, billionaire, and father of the bride. At the very wedding Zoe now found herself working, tray in hand, smile locked in place, trying not to sweat through her blouse. She wasn't supposed to be here tonight. She had taken the gig to get close, to see the Jennings family in person. Grace Jennings was untouchable, Harold even more so, but this wedding offered an opportunity, one chance to get a feel for who they were behind closed doors. She wasn't planning anything dramatic, just eyes open, ears sharper than usual. She hadn't expected to catch anyone's attention. And yet, as the toast ended and she crossed the floor with a tray of champagne flutes, she felt it. A sharp silence, like being watched in a crowded room. She turned just slightly and saw him, Robert Hayes, the groom's father. The Robert Hayes, one of the most powerful men on the East Coast. His eyes were locked on her hand, on the ring, and his expression wasn't just startled. It was haunted. Their eyes met, just for a second. But it was enough to know. He knew the ring, knew it too well. And in that moment, Zoe Harper's blood ran cold. She wasn't just wearing a mystery anymore. She was wearing a past that someone very, very powerful wasn't ready to see return. Robert Hayes didn't hear a word of the next 2 speeches. People laughed, applauded, toasted. The bride wiped away joyful tears. Cameras flashed like starlight, but Robert's world had narrowed into a funnel of noise and memory. All he could see was the ring. All he could feel was the last time he'd held it, in his hand, clenched tight, scorched with ash, the only thing recovered from the blaze. The fire. 25 years had passed since that night, but it still lived inside him. The emergency call, the distant sirens, the twisted wreckage of the guest house outside Aspen, the coroner's report that had more guesses than facts. It was too hot, too fast, bodies unidentifiable. The children were assumed to be in the nursery. Sarah's remains were never found. The only thing pulled from the wreckage was that emerald ring, discovered lodged beneath a melted beam, half blackened, yet unmistakable. He had locked it in a velvet box, buried it in the back of his safe. He never showed it to anyone again. And now it was on the hand of a waitress at his son's wedding. Impossible. And yet, the girl, Zoe, moved like someone used to being invisible. She carried herself with humility, not entitlement. She wasn't flaunting the ring. If anything, she looked like she was trying to disappear. That told Robert something. It told him she didn't know who he was. But who was she? He rose quietly from the head table and slipped into the corridor just outside the ballroom, phone in hand. The hallway was lined with oil paintings and gold trim, but none of it mattered. He tapped a number he hadn't used in nearly 3 years. "Maria Castellanos," a voice answered. "It's Robert Hayes," he said. "I need you." There was a beat of silence. Then, "How soon?" "Now." He gave her the name printed on the server's tag. Zoe H. By the time he returned to his seat, Grace and Ryan were preparing for their first dance. The lights dimmed. The crowd turned toward the polished floor. Robert watched for Zoe instead. He caught sight of her across the room, quietly helping an elderly woman with her napkin. Kind, calm. Then she turned to cross the floor again, and the emerald flickered under the chandeliers. He didn't see a waitress anymore. He saw Sarah. Not in her face, though now that he thought of it, the girl had Sarah's cheekbones, her posture, her quiet certainty. No, it was something deeper, the way she scanned a room for pain, the way she moved toward it, not away. Could it be? His pulse picked up. The math almost worked. Zoe looked about 25. That would make her the same age as his twins would have been, if they'd survived. But how could she have survived? And why would someone let him believe they had all perished? He didn't want to believe it, didn't dare. Hope was too dangerous a drug. But later that night, long after the toasts and dancing ended, he found the napkin Zoe had left behind on a table. It had her name scrawled in quick handwriting, probably for inventory. He tucked it into his pocket and called in another favor. Maria had access to genetic databases, one of the perks of being semi-retired and slightly morally flexible. See if she's registered anywhere, medical records, orphanages, anything. And check for a sibling, Robert said. I want answers. He paused, then added one final instruction. And run a private match against mine. Quietly. I want to know if she's mine. I want to know everything. Robert hung up the phone, heart pounding. It wasn't just business anymore. It was personal, and if the truth was what he feared and hoped, it might be. Then someone had lied to him, someone powerful, and he was about to find out why. Grace Jennings had always known her father was a complicated man. To the world, Harold Jennings was a brilliant visionary, the man who turned Jennings Global into a multinational juggernaut, a negotiator who never raised his voice, a gentleman with a Harvard smile and an iron handshake. But Grace knew a different version. She'd seen the late-night phone calls with voices raised behind locked doors. She'd watched people disappear from the company without warning. She'd overheard whispers of favors and settlements and non-disclosures growing up at the dinner table. Her mother never asked questions. Her older brother moved to Europe just to stay out of Harold's orbit, but Grace had stayed. She told herself it was for her career, that she could learn from him, that power could be used for good once she had enough of it. And now she was marrying into the Hayes family, merging two dynasties, building something unbreakable, or so she thought. It was near midnight when Grace slipped out of her dressing room to find Harold. She needed a moment, a hug, maybe even a bit of fatherly warmth. Instead, she found him in a dim corner of the catering wing, speaking in a hushed tone with Decca, the head of his private security detail. Broad-shouldered, always wearing a Bluetooth earpiece, the kind of man who rarely smiled and never blinked. Grace was about to call out to them until she heard her name. She saw the ring, Decca said flatly. The old man froze. He recognized it. There was a pause. Her father's voice dropped. Then we make sure the waitress doesn't come back tomorrow, Harold said, low and cold. Too much risk. I told you the fire would come back to haunt us. Grace's blood turned to ice. Fire? Waitress? She leaned closer, but a clatter from the kitchen forced her to duck back behind a silk curtain. When she peeked again, they were gone. Her father's wine glass still sat on the edge of the counter, untouched. Grace's thoughts spiraled. What fire? Who was the waitress? She ran through every face she'd seen that night, trying to remember anyone who stood out. And then she saw her, A server in black, crossing the hallway with a stack of dessert trays. Her face was flushed, strands of auburn hair loose from her bun. Grace narrowed her eyes. And there, on the girl's hand, glinted something green, an emerald, a ring. Suddenly, Grace's wedding day didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a setup, a trap with too many secrets. She followed. Zoe moved quickly, heading toward the side exit by the catering bay, probably done with her shift. Grace caught up just as the girl pushed open the door. "Wait!" Grace called out. Zoe turned, startled. They faced each other in the moonlit corridor, bride and waitress, heiress and orphan, both stunned to be here. Grace didn't bother with pleasantries. Instead, she looked straight at the emerald ring and asked the question she'd never thought she'd have to ask at her own wedding. "Where did you get that ring?" Zoe stared at her for a long moment, then quietly replied, "It's the only thing I've ever had from my mother." And with that, Grace felt the first crack splinter in her perfectly curated world. Zoe had been expecting questions, suspicion, maybe even a threat, but not this. Grace Jennings stood in front of her, no longer the glowing bride from hours before, but a woman torn between two legacies. Her perfect posture trembled slightly. Her voice, when she spoke again, was softer, barely louder than the wind whispering through the corridor. "I think my father knows something about you," she said, "and I think he's hiding something from me, too." Zoe blinked, uncertain. "Why would your father care who I am?" Grace hesitated, then took a breath like someone about to cross a line they'd been taught never to touch. 25 years ago, there was a fire. A house owned by the Hayes family burned to the ground. Sarah Hayes, Robert's wife, was declared dead, along with her twins, but Robert never believed it was an accident. Zoe's heart thudded in her chest. Grace continued, "I overheard my father tonight. He mentioned the fire. He sounded afraid." Zoe finally spoke. "We found microfilm hidden inside this ring." She held up her hand. The emerald gleamed in the pale light. "It shows financial fraud, shell companies linked to Jennings Global. My brother and I, Luke, we grew up in different orphanages. We just found each other a few months ago. DNA confirmed we're twins." Grace stepped back, visibly shaken. "Your mother was Sarah Hayes." Zoe nodded slowly. "We think she survived the fire. For a while. We don't know what happened after, but she hid the evidence in this ring. I don't think she trusted anyone, not even the law." Grace looked down, then back up. "There's someone you need to meet." That someone was already waiting. Robert Hayes stood in the private library of his Manhattan townhouse, staring at a photo in his hand. It was a printout from Maria's report. A surveillance still of Zoe, smiling faintly while pouring coffee at the diner down the block from her apartment. Next to him stood Luke. The resemblance was undeniable. It wasn't just the eyes or the mouth, it was the posture, the way Luke ran a hand through his hair when he was thinking, just like Robert used to do when he was young. Robert had cried once in the last 25 years, the night of the fire. Now he fought back tears again. The front door opened. Zoe entered, followed by Grace. The room was silent as the four of them finally stood together. Zoe took a deep breath. "I think you're my father." Robert didn't speak. He walked slowly across the room, reached into his coat, and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it. Inside was a blackened ring, twisted vines, an emerald dulled by time and flame. Zoe raised her hand. Her ring shimmered, whole, untouched, but identical. No words were needed. Luke looked at Robert, his voice cracking slightly. "Did you ever think we might still be alive?" Robert nodded, his voice thick. "Every day. But no one believed me, no one. But your mother." Zoe opened her notebook and placed the microfilm onto the table. Grace leaned forward. "My family did this. My father did this. We have to expose him." Maria stepped from the hallway, quiet and composed. "There's a gala this Saturday. Jennings Global is announcing their new philanthropic initiative. Press will be everywhere. Harold will be speaking." Zoe looked to Grace. "Are you sure you're ready?" Grace straightened. He built his empire on secrets. He destroyed your family. He used mine. It ends now." Robert folded the microfilm into an envelope. "We'll confront him together, but we do it smart. No drama, just truth." Luke nodded. "And backup. I have friends at the DOJ. Quiet ones." Maria smiled. "I've already tipped the FBI. If Harold panics, they'll be waiting." Zoe glanced down at her ring one last time, the symbol of a lost mother's last act of courage. She closed her fist. "I'm ready." The Jennings Global Winter Gala was a monument to opulence. Held at the Metropolitan Heritage Museum, every column was draped in silk, every table lit by suspended glass orbs glowing gold. Strings of violins echoed through the marbled hall, the notes crisp and icy like December air. Politicians mingled with CEOs. Camera crews whispered behind velvet ropes. It wasn't just a party, it was a performance. Harold Jennings loved a good performance. He stood beneath the spotlight on the grand dais, his polished voice wrapping the crowd in applause as he spoke of legacy, unity, and investing in a future built on trust. He smiled for the cameras, but beneath his cufflink, sweat dotted his wrist. Robert Hayes stood in the back of the room, perfectly still. Beside him were Luke and Zoe, poised but trembling. Grace stood near the stage, expression blank, hands behind her back, like a dutiful daughter, until Harold's final line, "And in honor of my late wife and our shared commitment to community." Grace stepped forward. "Actually," she said into the microphone, her voice firm, "we're honoring someone else tonight." The room stilled. Cameras turned, whispers sparked like static. Harold froze. Zoe stepped up beside Grace. "My name is Zoe Harper. 25 years ago, I was reported dead in a fire, along with my twin brother. Our mother was Sarah Hayes." She held up her hand. The emerald ring glittered under the lights. Luke stepped forward. "And I'm Dr. Luke Harper. We were placed into different orphanages. We never knew who we were. Until now." Robert joined them, standing taller than he had in years. "I buried an empty grave," he said, voice steady, "because someone wanted me to believe they were gone." Maria, waiting by the doors, handed a folder to the press. Documents, the microfilm, banking records, testimonies, photographs. A complete outline of Harold Jennings's crimes, embezzlement, arson, falsified death records, and a cover-up that spanned decades. The crowd erupted in chaos. Reporters shouted. Flashes blinded. Harold reached into his pocket. Zoe's breath caught, but before he could pull anything free, Dika moved, fast, aggressive, stepping between Harold and the stage. Then, "FBI, hands where we can see them." Suits emerged from the crowd. Agents surged forward. Deka raised his hands slowly. A second agent tackled Harold just as he tried to run. Handcuffs clicked. Gasps filled the air. It was over in 30 seconds. 25 years of silence, shattered. The next morning, headlines told the world what had happened. Jennings' empire crumbles under fire of truth. Waitress revealed as Billionaire's daughter in emotional confrontation. Harold Jennings was charged with conspiracy, fraud, arson, and obstruction. He pleaded not guilty, but the evidence was overwhelming. Deka, his longtime fixer, turned state witness to avoid life without parole. DNA confirmed what the world already suspected. Zoe and Luke Harper were Robert Hayes' children, but not all stories end in courtrooms. 3 months later, the sun was warm over the newly built Sarah Hayes Memorial Garden on the Upper West Side. A fountain trickled gently in the center, surrounded by stone benches engraved with words like courage, truth, and second chances. Robert stood beside Zoe and Luke, his hand resting on each of their shoulders. Ryan, now CEO of the unified Hayes Jennings enterprise, smiled as he introduced Grace, founder of the Sarah Hayes Foundation for Lost Children. Grace turned to Zoe. "You saved more than your family. You exposed everything he buried." Zoe nodded quietly. "She saved us." "We just finished what she started." Robert reached into his pocket and handed each of them a small box. Inside, a matching emerald pin. Not a ring, not a crown, Just a simple green stone shaped like a heart, engraved with one word on the back. Family. Luke pinned his to his lapel. Grace clipped hers onto her blazer. Zoe hesitated, then placed hers over her heart. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt home. The garden shimmered in the afternoon light, but it wasn't just sunlight that made it beautiful. It was the memory of a mother's last gift, and the fire that once destroyed everything, now lighting the way forward.